I'm going to talk about the current US economic conditions as of March of 2020. And I have chosen March of 2020 because this sort of encapsulates the most recent data that is available in terms of the economic conditions. So essentially, my main argument is that the coronavirus and the oil surplus have rendered the economy less than ideal. And now we're sort of seeing things contract and things start to grind to a halt. And so to explore that, we're going to take a look at unemployment. We're going to take a look at changes in the production of goods, services, changing sentiment, and ultimately general volatility. So it's important to understand that the business sector is showing signs of negative growth. And if we take a look at productivity, actually, one of the things that we need to be cognizant of is the fact that the most recent data available is Q4 data, which was released in early March. And so it's likely outdated. So even though the rating is average, and back when the data was released, things were slowing at 1.2%. Output was up at 2.4%, and hours worked was actually up as well. This is likely outdated. And we're not going to know for a few more months what the actual situation looks like in terms of productivity. Although based on the layoffs we've seen, we can sort of guess. So in terms of shipments, orders, and inventories, we're seeing across the board decreases. Things that were getting worse are now getting worse faster. And the sentiment sort of says that the manufacturing sector in general is contracting from growing, and overall things are starting to grow slower. And again, as we start to see April data, we'll see how things change and if things get worse. And we sort of suspect that they will at this point. So then in terms of industrial production, we see that overall production is down 5.4%, which is a marked decrease from what we've seen in previous months and previous years. And then finally, the sentiment is largely negative, both in terms of the ISM and in terms of the Michigan survey. And so all of these metrics are contracting or slowing or too low or contracting faster. Inventories are low. And generally, the people that are surveyed are starting to get worried. And they talk a lot about the coronavirus when they are surveyed about what they're worried about. So it's also important to understand that the government sector is taking some really extraordinary measures to try to combat economic slowing. And the first measure is COVID-19 relief. So we're seeing stimulus checks go out to eligible Americans this month, and there's actually talk about expanding those into further payments as the pandemic goes on. We've seen increases in unemployment benefits and also increases in unemployment claims. And so those things are being taken advantage of readily. And there's talk of expanding the moratorium on student loan interest accrual to include mortgages and rent relief and things like that. And so, on the other hand, we see the United States cutting back the production of oil. And so, all this talk about why production is so important and it's bad that it's slowing, the question is why is it important to slow oil production? And the answer to that is actually because it's now becoming costly to produce oil and we're running out of places to store it as Russia and Saudi Arabia enter their price war and increase their own production. The United States will need to slow their production in order to sort of bump the price back up so that oil doesn't actually reach a negative profitability. Furthermore, we've seen the prices of both imports and exports fall in the month of March. And the BLS says that this is primarily because of a decrease in oil prices. But to a lesser extent, the coronavirus has had some impact on this. So I want to primarily focus on import prices because we can see some pretty drastic fluctuations here. And the same thing is true with exports, but things have really changed most significantly in terms of imports. So we've seen the prices of imports fall 2.3% in March, which follows a 0.7% decrease in February. And if we go all the way back to a year ago in March of 2019, we see that prices were actually up by 0.6%. So this is a pretty drastic change in the course of a year. And so, furthermore, we saw the US export price decrease by 1.6% after falling 1.1% in February. And so these export prices have sort of been a little bit lower for a little bit longer. But as we see the United States scale back production, in the coming months, we will see how the prices of oil are impacted and how these things change. They might get better, they might get worse. It's really hard to say at this point. Now, if we take a look at the CPI, we sort of see that the prices have fallen in a domestic context, and they will likely continue to do so. According to the ISM, prices are actually decreasing at a faster rate. And so this negative 0.4% change that we see this March, which is sort of the mirror image of a year ago with a 0.4% increase, we might expect to see further decreases in these prices. And so ultimately, there are two factors that are responsible for this, and sort of they're the two factors that I outlined at the beginning of the presentation: the coronavirus and the change in gas prices. And so we sort of see the energy index outlined in this report fall 5.8%. And the gasoline index decreased 10.5%. So we see that factor is sort of swaying and helping to motivate things to trend down here. Um, and again, we're seeing prices change as people sort of stay inside and stop traveling and stop buying things. So now I want to take a look at some of the most compelling data that suggests, in conjunction with everything else, that the US economy is pretty bleak right now. So in March of this year, we saw an increase in unemployment by 0.9%, bringing the total up to 4.4%. And this is actually the largest increase we've seen since January of 1975, when we saw about a 1% increase as well. So we're down in total about 701,000 farm jobs. That number will very likely increase as the April data gets released. But one thing we can see is that even though the 1975 graph, which is on the bottom of the screen, and the March of this year graph, which is on the top of the screen, represent similar increases in terms of percentage, there are so many more claims in terms of just pure numbers that we're seeing in the present day graph, in the 2020 graph, which really sort of suggests that the situation is dire and is rapidly becoming worse. So, the March Census Bureau data to me represents some of the most compelling evidence that we have sort of entered a period of economic contraction that will only be made worse if things continue in the way they have been. And so, pretty obviously, most of this is due to the coronavirus, right? We've seen, because of the economic shutdown, an 8.7% decrease in total sales. And that contrasts the previous month, which was a 0.4% decrease. So that's a really significant gap. And then a 6.2% decrease in total sales over the course of the year, and that is adjusted. And if we take a look at the businesses that were hit the hardest, we start to see a pattern emerge, a pattern of non-essential businesses, right? By far, the types of businesses that are being patronized significantly less are clothing and accessory stores, and those sales are down 50%. They've been cut in half. Next on the list, we see furniture stores and food service and drinking places, all sort of down about 26, 27%. And this really supports the narrative that the coronavirus has a main role to play in this economic contraction, because these are the sort of places that we've been told to avoid because of the pandemic, and these are the sort of places that have been deemed non-essential and are sort of shutting down, whether voluntarily or not. So, the most important thing to ascertain from this presentation is the notion that the data that is encapsulated by March of 2020 represents a certain volatility that demonstrates both that the economy is already bad and that it will likely continue to worsen. And so we can sort of trace out a cause and effect relationship that is manifested itself in the releases we've gone over. First is the oil price war that erupted between Russia and Saudi Arabia this year, which has led to an increase in oil production, a decrease in the price, and ultimately a sharp decrease in both the consumer price index and the imports and exports price index. The second cause of the less than ideal economic situation is the coronavirus, which has caused an increase in UI claims, of course, a decrease in unemployment, and ultimately that drop in retail sales that we analyzed earlier. Finally, some of the effects we've just analyzed become causes of their own, which is how we get in that cycle of the worsening economy in the first place. So, chiefly, the decrease in import and export prices and the decrease in food and retail sales contribute to a general uncertainty, and we can actually see that sentiment is down 11.9 points. And the last time the sentiment fell that much was in 2008 with the market crash. Ultimately, because of the global pandemic and the international feud regarding oil prices, the US economy is in a contracting state, And the March 2020 data suggests that this will only worsen